We have a very varied programme today. We've had two quite different talks so far, and that variety will be spread even wider now as we come to this talk by Keith Fox. Keith, as you've already heard, is not able to be with us in person this morning because he's not been well, but he's well enough to give his talk from home, so he'll be up on the screen rather than standing here at the front. You've had biographical notes, and I'm not going to recite the whole of what you've been sent about Keith. I'll just point out that Keith, among all his experiences and responsibilities, has chaired this organisation, Christians in Science, in the past, and he is currently serving as the editor of our journal, Science and Christian Belief. Keith, as a biochemist, has spent most of his career in Southampton, where he's now Emeritus Professor there. And he has written a lot, and he's spoken a lot, and he does have a new scientific paper in Cambridge Papers, which you'll hear about from Mary in Précis or an update. I won't give you the details here. And Keith, therefore, has spoken at a lot of conferences, Christians and Science and other conferences, on genetics and on evolution, and his topic for today is evolution, and I'll hand straight over to Keith to take us through his topic.
Great, thank you, Bill. I'm really sorry, everybody, that I can't be with you this morning. It's a small matter of a virus of about 30,000 nucleotides called COVID, which has been attacking me for the past week or so. I'd survived without getting COVID for a long time, and everybody was saying, haven't I got any friends? And then 10 days ago, I'm afraid I succumbed. So we're dealing with the topic of evolution today. I'm aware that I'm talking probably to a mixed audience of those who come from biological or more physical sciences. So I'll try and keep some things relatively straightforward. I hope I'll provoke you. If you agree with everything that I say, then I'll probably miss the mark. And we'll see how we go. Let me just see if I can go through this process of sharing my screen. And I think that's worked okay. So evolution, is it friend or foe of those who are people of faith? I think before we start any discussion of evolution itself, we need to bound this within the Christian doctrine of creation, which isn't just an abstract, academic, theoretical question about origins and how we interpret science. But as we look at creation and how we understand God our Creator, it should be something that moves us to worship and something that moves us to action. Because the biblical view is that God is the originator, sustainer of the whole of creation. Not just the stars out there, but the wonderful molecules that I've had the privilege of studying for years, especially DNA. It's all his handiwork. We observe the world with a sense of awe and wonder, and we as Christians have the privilege of being able to say, do you know, I know the God who made all that. I know him, not just know about him, as other speakers have said. So any discussions that we have about evolution or creation must be underpinned with a robust theology of creation. That God is the source of all that exists. The things that we see and the things that we don't see. And getting that into our heads, that he is over all of it. And he does things the way in which he wants. As the psalmist put it, he does whatever pleases him. So we can't prejudge the issue of how the world might have been made or how biology works. God does it in whatever way he wants to, and we investigate that. And there's those lovely words from Colossians chapter 1 that reinforce that. For in him, that's in Christ, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. And I think we need to get that into our heads before we start to think about any of the details. People like me who accept evolution as a scientific explanation of the complexity of the biological world as we look around it often sit as piggy in the middle. We have on one side the new atheists who attack us and say, you cannot believe in evolution and believe in God. And similarly, you have well-meaning Christians at the other end, both from intelligent design and young earthers, who say, no, you compromised your faith. So we stick sometimes as that piggy in the middle. I rather like this quote, when I saw that was under attack from both sides, I knew that I must be on the right track. Of course, many people would choose not to talk about it at all, just to ignore it. I think this is an apocryphal quote from the wife of the Bishop of Worcester when she first heard about Darwin's theory of evolution. My dear, let us hope it is not true, but if it is, let us pray that it will not become generally known. As sort of sticking your head in the sand and hoping that the problem will go away. Now, as we as scientists and people of Christian faith, we cannot take that attitude. We must look carefully at what God has provided for us. We have to be honest that people feel uncomfortable about evolution. Not just Christians. There are many secular people who feel uncomfortable about it. But particularly for Christians, there's these, I think, 6 things I've noted there. They think it contradicts the Bible. They think that it leads to atheism. Well, it's only a theory, it's a hunch. There's something about our own position, and that surely we're special, aren't we? It raises questions about death and suffering. And to be honest, Darwinism has been improperly applied to other areas of life in social Darwinism. Of course, and I have had discussions with somebody who really seriously thought that evolution was what it was called, and therefore it must be evil. I hope we don't need to take quite that extreme view. But some of the young Earth people, and here's Ken Ham from the Creation Research Institute, is actually blaming evolution for all of life's problems. If the church wants to be successful in changing society's attitudes, it says, the foundational basis of evolution needs to be destroyed and the foundational basis of creation restored to its rightful place of importance. So there are those who think that evolution and the theory of evolution has undermined everything that we believe to be moral. But as we look at this, I think there are really 4 major options. And you obviously, if you know my background, I should be going for the 4th of these. There are those who take a young earth view, a literal interpretation of Genesis chapters 1 and 2. There are old earth creationists who have a form of concordist view for that the earth is old, but there were special acts of creation on 6 occasions. There are those who take an intelligent design view that says, God has intervened in his creation. And there are those, like myself, who would follow what might be called theistic evolution, or the Americans now are taking this term evolutionary creationism, which is technically accurate but quite a mouthful. As we discuss evolution with people, we do need, as in any conversation with people, to understand where they're coming from and why they might have questions about it. If their starting point is their interpretation of Scripture, then I venture to suggest that there's little point in trying to explain the science to them. So we need to talk with people who take that sort of view about how they interpret Scripture. How does God act in the world? What type of literature is there in Genesis chapters 1 and 2? And we should say there is far more in the Bible about creation and the wonder of that than there is in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Let's broaden our horizons to all that the psalmists say. It may be that people have a problem with evolution because they have genuine problems with the science, in which case it is our duty to try and explain the science to them. What do we mean, though, by evolution? I've used that term already. At the very simplest level is that organisms have changed over time, what you might call natural history, good old biology as it was taught in school. But over time, originally things were very simple, and then you get more complicated organisms appearing with time. I don't think anybody has a problem with that, really. There's then evolution as a mechanism, how mutations and natural selection have generated the complexity and the different species that we see around us. And thirdly, there's evolution then as an atheistic worldview, what we might call naturalism. Now, Christians will want to respond against the last one of those, because naturalism is a view of the world that excludes the supernatural or the spiritual. So we will want to argue very strongly against the last one of that. And I think the danger is that in doing so, we then start to attack the next one up and start to question the very science behind evolution, simply as a means of destroying the myth that evolution has to be atheistic. So here's some well-known quotes from Richard Dawkins. Darwinism made it possible for him to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. The universe we observe, he said, is precisely the properties we should expect if there is a bottom: no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Or from a paleontologist, man is the result of purposelessness and materialistic processes that did not have him in mind. He was not planned. And a Christian would want to argue against both of those views. Yes, we were planned. Yes, we are made in the image of God. Yes, we are special. There is a teleology to biology. As philosopher Alvin Plantinga said, and he accepts the scientific theory of evolution and says that all Christians should do. He says there is the belief that evolution rules out the existence of God is not a scientific claim. He writes that it's a metaphysical or theological addition to that. And he adds, there is superficial conflict but deep concord between science and theistic religion. But superficial concord and deep conflict between science and naturalism. And it's that word naturalism that seems to exclude the presence of God. So come back again. So what do we mean by evolution? Natural selection. Basically, the organisms have each species has individual variations within them that are faithfully transmitted from parent to offspring with a few mutations and changes each generation. All organisms produce more offspring than are required to replace themselves in the next generation, and then there is a limited resources, a struggle for existence, not just in terms of resources, but those that breed fastest, that reproduce and give the most offspring, will be more successful. And the successful ones survive and reproduce, and on average, by virtue of those individual variations, are better suited to the environment that they came in. They weren't designed for that environment, but they've evolved so that they fit very well into it. And so we see these little diagrams. They get monstrously complicated. It's not a tree of life, it's a bush. There are many, many branches of all sorts of things appearing and disappearing at various stages, where everything within that at their particular time was fitted to their own particular niche. And things appear designed because they're adapted for the particular environment that they evolved in. And descent and modification and selection has therefore shaped the biological world around us. Let me deal with one other matter of definition. You may hear the word neo-Darwinism or modern evolutionary synthesis. I prefer the latter. I try to keep the word Darwinism out of it because it rather attacks an individual rather than a philosophy or a science. And so modern evolutionary synthesis is the integration of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection together with Mendel's theory of genetics and the mathematical population genetics. Other phrases have been used to describe it: the modern synthesis, evolutionary synthesis, or neo-Darwinian synthesis. But I prefer modern evolutionary synthesis. I say it avoids criticizing Darwin as a person. Of course, as already been said in the first talk today, evolution is a different question to that of the origin of life itself, abiogenesis. Darwin said if we could conceive in some warm little pond with sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc. present, but maybe life could develop from inorganic means. That's not evolution. That is a different question. Evolution is the question of how organisms and species change over time. But let's quickly just think about some of the problems within that. Some people have suggested life could have started in hot springs at the bottoms of these oceans in hydrothermal vents. What came first, DNA or protein? We need DNA to make proteins. We need protein to make DNA. The chicken or the egg? Or somebody else said Maybe it's the hen house. That all has to be enclosed within a lipid environment. To be honest, we haven't any idea at all. There are lots of theories out there. It gives great problems. Why is it that only certain chiral forms of amino acids are used, only the L amino acids? Why is it usually D sugars? All these things raise big problems to which we actually don't have solutions. So there's no entirely plausible hypothesis for the spontaneous generation of life. But that does not mean that supernatural activity is the only possible explanation. And whether the origin of life was natural or supernatural, let's be clear that it was of God. That doesn't mean to say we shouldn't investigate it. We should look at these with good scientific methods. And we have to ask the question as to how does God's activity within the world extend to the transition between non-life and life? Did God actually create the whole cosmos in such a way that chemicals could become alive? And we've already pondered over what we mean by life. Excuse me. Because the Bible doesn't point to the unknowable as evidence of God. It points to the pattern that can be seen in God's creation. Because God is not just a maintainer of the world, the biological world, but he's the sustainer, involved in every single aspect of it. And the Bible points to God's design and creation in the things that we do understand, more so than the things that we don't understand. In fact, the more that we understand, the more amazed we are. And as Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, we're to find God in what we know, not in what we don't know. God wants us to realize his presence, not in unsolved problems, but in those that are solved. And we need to be aware then of a God of the gaps that says, that attributes to God those things that I can't explain and can't understand. Because after all, science is concerned with understanding those things that we don't know. And that, to my mind, is what makes science fun. It's good to discover. And Charles Coulson, Professor of Theoretical Chemistry, also known as Professor of Theological Chemistry by some people, when we come to the scientifically unknown, our correct policy is not to rejoice because we've found God. It is to become better scientists. So what are the evidences for evolution scientifically? Well, if you ask a man or woman in the street, probably they'll say, well, it's fossils. They may say about observations and variations in nature, which is actually where Darwin came from. They may talk about anatomical and developmental similarities. But there have been massive developments in our understanding since Darwin. Darwin had no mechanism to account for this. And of course, now we know about genetics and DNA and the wonders of the ways that works. And his theory is now supported by a wealth of experimental evidence. And I just want to, for a few moments, indulge in some of that. Now, firstly, we know that the genetic code is common across all organisms, whether we're talking about very primitive microorganisms right through to complex things like you and me. The genetic code is exactly the same. It rather looks as though it arose once and everything originated from it. We can compare DNA sequences, the genomes, the relatedness of living things, which comes totally independent of any paleontology or anatomy. And here's something there. Let me actually get a pointer up. Let's see. Here we're comparing a human chromosomes with chimpanzee ones. And you can see how they're very, very similar all the way across. There are some places where a piece of the genome has been inverted, one to the other. Chromosome 2 for humans appears to be the joining of two chimpanzee chromosomes together. And those similarities between the genomes of different organisms rather suggest that we have some form of common ancestors. Although there are those, and these are quotes actually from John Lennox, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. He describes that as being a relationship of the gaps, which could equally be read as evidence of common design, not necessarily common descent. But our genomes are fossil records of our past. They're full of things called endogenous retroviruses. That's pieces of DNA that have been inserted into our genomes. And retrotransposons, bits that move around our DNA. That seems to have, well, originally they were called junk DNA. I think that is, they'd be inappropriate to call it that. I think we don't know what all of these do. but they appear almost randomly in the genome. And you can trace these over time as to when do they appear. If there's one of those inserted in humans, is it there in chimpanzees and gorillas and bonobos and so on? We can go back through and actually trace, rather like doing a sort of cryptic puzzle. When did that evolution, when did that appear? And you can start to construct evolutionary trees based on the appearance of these things. I find that very difficult to explain in terms of a common design. Now, there have been millions of these events, and if you trace the ways in which they occurred, it's the same lineage as been shown by standard evolutionary theories before we knew anything about the genetics. We know that our genes, too, are full of what are called pseudogenes. That's pieces of DNA that in our dim history may have been useful, but since we don't use them, and so they become corrupted over time. I rather like this illustration of the gene for the synthesis of vitamin C. You have to take your 5 a day because we can't make our own vitamin C. But the enzyme that would have been used to make it is there in our genome in a corrupted fashion. You'll find it too in chimpanzees and hamsters, insects and fish that also can't make their own vitamin C. So we can use these, if you like, as molecular fossils that say where have we come from. And you can say exactly the same about olfactory genes. We don't have as many functional genes for smelling things as many of our other organisms. One of the classic examples of evolution that's quoted in all school textbook is the industrial melanism from a mutation in the British peppered moth. We actually now understand that mutation at the molecular level. It's the insertion of a large, and it's about 21,000 nucleotides transposable element into a gene within the white version. And by looking at the genetics of that, you can start to ask, when did that happen? And it probably happened, well, the peak likelihood is around 1819, so it fits in with that industrialization. Some people will say is evolution a theory in crisis, to which I want to give the answer a resounding no. There are questions about evolution in terms of some of the details of it, but no, it is not a theory in crisis. I want to get that into people's heads. And I rather like this rather long quote from Todd Wood, who was a young Earth creationist. And I think this is brutally honest of him when he says evolution is not a theory in crisis. It's not teetering on the edge of collapse. It hasn't failed as a scientific explanation. He goes on basically to say it's the best explanation on the block. But then goes on to say, I just don't accept it because it contradicts what I think the Bible says about the history of life on Earth. I think that's brutally honest, and I respect that position. But he is at least saying, don't come to me with any nonsense about it being a theory in crisis. It's got very good experimental evidence behind it. I just don't accept it. Now, there have been, of course, ways in which there have been questions about evolution. There was a Royal Society meeting in November 2016, new trends in evolutionary biology, biological, philosophical, and social science perspectives by some very eminent people, Dennis Noble, Nancy Cartwright, John Dupre, etc. And they're arguing that the standard evolutionary model itself is not wrong, but it's not sufficient. And we need other ways of looking at things. And they would argue that they would question as to whether evolution is mainly driven by random genetic variations or whether other factors come into play. They are very careful to distance themselves from anything to do with intelligent design, although their arguments have been misused, I think, by some who follow intelligent design. And they say that instead of making genes as the focal point of evolution, organisms as a whole ought to take that place. After all, we know that evolution takes place in communities of organisms, not just in individual cells. And they point out some things that we need to be aware of, how organisms can actually affect their own evolution in terms of niche construction. You know, beavers build dams, and therefore beavers that are best adapted to the dams that they build will evolve more likely. Evolution and developmental biology, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, some epigenetics, the whole area of plasticity, of how some aspects of our genomes are not fixed but develop with time. But they emphasize that these are interesting special cases, but they don't overthrow the general paradigm of the modern synthesis of evolution. There are questions to ask, and very real questions, but they don't overthrow the whole lot. When I was at school, I was fascinated by maths, physics, and chemistry, and I have to be honest and say that biology was rather boring because it just seemed a little bit like stamp collecting to me in those days, nearly 60 years ago. Theodosius Drzhansky wrote this article in the American Biology Teacher, and he was a practicing Russian Orthodox Christian. He says it's wrong to hold creation and evolution as mutually exclusive alternatives. I'm a creationist and an evolutionist. Evolution is God's or nature's method of creation. Creation is not an event that happened in 4004 BC. It's a process that began some 10 billion years ago and is still underway. And the title of his article was "Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution." And as a teenage biology, somebody who didn't like biology as a teenager, I can quite see why that's the case. It's nothing more than stamp collecting. What about evolution and chance? Here's this famous quote from Jacques Monod: "Pure chance, absolutely free but blind, at the root of the stupendous edifice of evolution." Is evolution a chance process? Well, mutation is a random process, where those damages happen in the genome, where things in genomes get moved around. That is random, or roughly random. It's not strictly speaking that. But natural selection picks out the best adapted from that pool. So natural selection is not a chance process. And of course, Christians have various views on whether chance and randomness are appropriate. Because from an earthly perspective, things may seem to happen at random. But Scripture affirms that God is in control, and he's able to take those random acts of natural law, the free will of good and evil men, and use that to accomplish his good and perfect will. And we might ask the question, if God doesn't use randomness, why does it look that way to us? There are plenty of things in the world around us that we make predictions based on randomness, from weather forecasts, for instance. And you can pick out scriptural references about the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. In their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. And this quote from the book at the bottom there, from one queen: somebody drew his bow at random and hit the king of Israel, and that was the death of King Ahab. Of course, people feel uncomfortable about evolution about human evolution. Something like, where do we come from? What about other Homo species, in particular, Neanderthals? And we now know that between 1% and 4% of our genome is related to Neanderthals and other hominids. We see some form of interbreeding. In fact, it's not just Neanderthals. There's this Denisovans as well. And it seems as though different parts of the world have different complexities in the ways in which there has been interbreeding. So that if we look at humans, Homo sapiens arising out of Africa, the old out of Africa hypothesis, going across the globe, those that go furthest, of course, want the greatest amount of interaction with other hominids. Those that stayed in Africa will probably have less experience with them. So if you look at the African genome, it has less Neanderthal DNA in it than us Europeans. So we need to have a robust theology of the origin of humans, or what it means to be human. And just want, as we come to the end, think a little bit about intelligent design. This is the assertion that certain features of the universe and living things are best explained by an intelligent causation, and that ordinary natural selection cannot explain it. The phenomenon called irreducible complexity. Evolution cannot explain that. I rather like the cartoon here. I think you should be more explicit here in step 2, which is described as then a miracle occurs. And over time, those two proponents of intelligent design bring up several examples, from the bacterial flagellum to the blood clotting system to the immune system. And I'm really pleased that they do that, because actually it forces the molecular scientist and the genomic scientist to think, hang on, is there any way in which we can explain that? And here's a quote from an article published 15 years ago now in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, show that the core components of the bacterial flagellum originated through the successive duplication and modification of a few or perhaps even a single precursor gene. So this, I think the bacterial flagellum and the others, we've dealt with that now. And there is, of course, nothing in the cell that isn't amazingly complicated. This is, I'm not expecting you to look at that at all. It's just a metabolic pathway or a whole series of interlinked metabolic pathway. At whatever level biology is studied, it is complicated. Whether we look at it at DNA sequences or at protein structure or cell biology or developmental biology, biologists take that complexity for granted and actually stand in awe of the amazing complexity of all of life. Because there is nothing in the cell that isn't amazingly complicated. But that doesn't mean to say we need to invoke the miraculous to explain why it's complicated. Any more than I think it is amazing how a single cell can develop over time in the mother's womb into a baby and a complex being like you and me. We don't invoke the miraculous over that. We may use words like miracle. But it's complicated. We just don't understand it properly. So the question is intelligent design science? Well, there was a court case in 2005 to which in the US, in the state of Dover, ID is not science, it says. And I just want to be provocative and say, some of you may have read John Lennox's book. I have immense admiration for John Lennox as an apologist and a defender of the Christian faith. But I actually will be adventurous enough to suggest that I think he oversteps the mark in his latest book and is highly critical of neo-Darwinism and basically says that there are lots of things that it can't explain with the implication that it shouldn't explain. And he talks about information and information in DNA. And there's this awful book, thick, great 1,000-page tome entitled Theistic Evolution, which is a critique of what they think is creative evolution. And actually they're confusing theistic evolution with deism, with scientism. And I ask them rather silly questions. So it's rather like if you stop beating your grandmother question, like, did God guide evolution? Well, how do I respond to that? Do I say yes or do I say no? Did he do it by specific miraculous events? Or was this part of the unfolding of his way in which he works moment by moment in creation? So does God guide evolution? Well, yes. And well, no. What about, though, if we disagree with other Christians? And you will disagree with others. You go into any sizable church and you'll find people who take a whole variety of different views. Let's be honest, this is a secondary issue. We need to understand, as I said, where people come from. We need a theology of creation. We need to fairly represent other people's positions, and we need to be open and honest. And this book was published a few years ago by Todd Wood, who I've already mentioned, and Darrell Falk, who is a theistic evolutionist. The Fool and the Heretic, How Two Scientists Move Beyond Labels to a realistic and loving dialogue between the two of them. So evolution, friend or foe? Here's this quote from Aubrey Moore. Darwinism appeared and under the guise of a foe did the work of a friend. There is no division of labour between God and nature or God and law. For the Christian theologian, the facts of nature are the acts of God. And Darwinism, I think, rescued biology from and theology from, if you like, a deistic view of a mechanistic universe that was so wound up and let to go, to one in which things are happening all the time and God is involved in the whole process. I think I've gone a couple of minutes over my time, but thank you for your attention. I'd be delighted to take questions.
Yeah, we do have time for questions because we've got quite a good, generous lunch break anyway.
Do you find that evolution helps us when we're thinking about suffering? So can we kind of say that because we're in a world that has radioactive environment, which means that we mutate. Therefore, things like cancer are unavoidable kind of byproducts of the whole process.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a really, really good question, because in a sense it helps us with suffering, because as you said, it's an unavoidable part of the process. Death has been part of the created order as long as there's been life. It doesn't take away the individual problem of suffering. And there are those who say, well, did God have to use such an inefficient and wasteful and painful process to bring the complexity of life that we know it into being? I think it's just the way that it is, and it does, if you like, it's the side effect of evolution is that we need genetic change, and genetic changes that can lead to the evolution of new species equally can lead to the production of rogue cells that are cancerous, or rogue viruses that infect some of us and we'd really rather not. So yes, I think it begins to address some of the questions of suffering, but I think it raises a whole lot of other ones as well. How does God redeem the suffering that has taken place over millions of years in the created order? The Groaning of Creation by Christopher Southgate is a book that some people might like to delve into, of actually talking whether God has a means of redeeming all that suffering that's taken place in the biological world. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. I think one of the appeals of the intelligent design movement is that it has a clear place for natural theology, for apologetics, for giving a case to the secular world. I wondered, any comments from you on, do you see a place for natural theology alongside evolution? And because I feel if that was kind of pushed a bit more, that would really undermine the appeal of the kind of intelligent design.
Yes, thank you. Very good question. I mean, I am personally highly critical of the intelligent design movement. It's kind of a designer of the gaps, if you like. It's that things are too complicated, which often means that we don't have sufficient theories at the moment for explaining the way that things are. So I'm very uncomfortable with it. It makes God into a tinkerer, of a God who comes in every now and then to tweak things in his creation, to bring something new into being, rather than the God who is upholding the universe, responsible for the whole caboodle, for moment by moment. And the question of intelligent design actually raises with it the question of what's not designed. I mean, the whole of nature is designed. As I said, the biologist looks at it and says the whole lot's wonderfully complicated, and it's wonderful. We may say the eye is designed. We know it's evolved tens of times in different formats. What about other things? Are they designed? So we're left with the question of maybe God specifically designed some things and others were just happenstance. And I don't think that squares with my theology and understanding of God as a creator, which is why I wanted to keep coming back. So we need a robust theology of creation. We could talk more about intelligent design. I know there are lots of people who find it a very attractive means of apologetics sometimes, but I'm highly suspicious that the edifice will collapse as we begin to understand some of the science behind the ways in which intelligent design says that we don't understand it. Thank you for that question. I'd love to talk more and more with that.
I was just wondering if you think it remarkable that a theory that was proposed by Darwin really to explain the distribution of organisms on the Earth's surface, which he saw when he travelled around the world, probably one of the first people actually to do that, observe the distribution of animals and plants. And there's so much that he didn't know and wouldn't be discovered for at least another century. I suppose the question is, it is quite remarkable that a theory that was developed against the background of such a lack of knowledge in many ways is still viable. And of course, then there's parallel question, the idea of reception history behind that, because it was accepted at different times in different countries. For example, it wasn't really accepted in France till the 1970s. It was largely perhaps because it wasn't invented there. So,
Yes, thank you. Really good question. I think it is remarkable that the more we know, the more it supports Darwin's original theory of evolution by natural selection. He had no mechanism. He knew nothing about genes. Mendel had been doing his work, but it wasn't known. We knew nothing about DNA as the source of inherited material until we get at least to the 1930s, and then the structure of DNA in the 1950s. So I think it is remarkable. The more that science advances, actually, the more that it supports Darwin's theory. There are, as we know, there are plenty of things that raise technical questions, things that say the whole theory itself may not explain everything. But it is remarkable, the insight that Darwin had that was actually based on, well, so if you read on the origin of species, a lot of that was dealing with pigeons and doves and selective breeding of those.
Great. We've got a couple of questions from online. So do you think the mind evolves, and how might that be linked to our DNA?
Ooh, that's a difficult one, and I'm going to bounce that back to Sharon, I think, from the previous speaker. It's clear that if you're talking about mind or brain, there's that question again, and what is the difference between those two? Clearly, our brains are much bigger than they need to be in terms of hunter-gatherers, and it is that, if you like, I don't know, it's massive increase in human brain size that has been responsible for so much of our cultural and evolution. So I'm going to duck that question, but I think clearly brains have evolved, and quite how that figures with the evolution of mind, I think I'd rather pass it over to people who are far more intelligent than me.
Oh, we've got one more. How do you think evolution would have happened before the fall in terms of waste, death, and suffering?
Right, thank you. That's a really deep and useful theological question as to what do we mean by the fall. And if you put a room full with 10 Christians in it, you have 12 different explanations at the very least. Clearly, over evolutionary time, there has been death and suffering well before the fall, however we interpret that. Humans have been around, living and dying for hundreds of thousands of years. So that does actually ask the question of what happened at the fall, and we probably don't have anything like enough time to begin to answer that question. In terms of the Genesis account, the day that you eat of the tree, you shall surely die. Well, actually, Adam and Eve didn't surely die on that day. But they did suffer spiritual death. They were separated from God. And when God expelled them from the garden, he said, was the effect of, let's get them out of here, lest they eat of the tree of life and live forever. So the implication of that is that it was never expected that humans would have eternal physical lives, but that the natural process of life and death and decay and actually resurrection are part of the truth of the way in which biological world works. So that's a really, really trite answer to a very, very deep and useful question. Thank you.
The title for today is Big Questions in Science and the Church, and this is one of the really big questions, of course, that we do get thrown up by people from a scientific or non-scientific background. We could go on for quite a while with questions. I'm going to have to say we'll have to leave those at the moment, but remember we do have a panel discussion session later. So if you've still got questions you want to ask, write them down, pass them on at lunchtime, and we will get them to the panel discussion this afternoon. I'm going to hand over in a moment to Mary for the practical aspects of what's going to happen next. But before we do, we obviously want to say thank you very much to Keith for his contribution. Keith, are you able to be with us for the panel discussion this afternoon?
I am able. I'm going to leave it to Steph and the tech team to work out how that may be possible. But yes, in principle, yes.
Yeah, good. And then we want to say thank you, Keith, and we also want to wish you a speedy recovery.